typically do. We have something, little feedback here. We have something much better. We have a speaker from the Center for Free Enterprise here at the College of Business. Professor Powell is going to be talking on immigration. And with that, I am going to pass it along to Professor Bowman, who is in fact the director of the center. I would like to point out the March 1 speaker's logbook. Please, if you do miss Professor Powell, see people staring at their computer, they're taking notes. So with that, I will turn it over to Steve.
We're going to wait until 11 to start, so we got a couple more minutes.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's all right. Sorry, it's a little loud here. Good morning and welcome. I'm Steve Goldman. I'm the director of the John H. Schnatter Center for Free Enterprise, and I want to welcome you guys here. Do a little house cleaning first. The center is sponsoring 2 more events this semester. On Tuesday, March 29th at 4:30 in this auditorium, Alex Tabarrok from George Mason University and Lars Smith from the University of Louisville Law School will be discussing intellectual property. And this is a really important area because the laws of the land were written on intellectual property probably in the 1800s, and things have changed a little bit since then. And so these guys are going to talk about intellectual property and the influence on innovation and entrepreneurship. And then on April 14th, at 4:30 in the auditorium here, we're going to have John Schnatter. Papa John's going to be here, and he's going to talk about better ingredients, better pizza, better business. And I think it'll be a great talk. John's a really good speaker. I also want to make a plug for the undergraduate students to consider economics majors. If you're not an economics major, you should be. It's pretty simple. You can pursue a BS degree, so you can get a business degree in economics and do all the business classes, or you can get a BA degree, which means you would take all the arts and sciences requirements and get an economics degree. So you can go either direction, either way you want to go. You can get an economics degree. It's great degree to have, great for jobs, great job opportunities, and you also get to learn really neat stuff. The center gives students lots of opportunities to engage in activities such as this. We have some reading groups. We just had a reading group this last weekend where we read a couple books. We discussed them all day, ate really good food, and very interesting. And so there's lots of opportunities. If you're interested, stop by the center. We also send out emails to all business majors, so you should be looking at your emails. Now to today's speaker. I'm happy to have Ben Powell, a good friend of mine here at the University of Louisville. Dr. Powell is the director of the Free Market Institute at Texas Tech University and professor of economics in the Rawls College of Business. He received his PhD from George Mason University. He's written numerous articles and several books. Our reading group for this semester actually just read his book, Out of Poverty, Sweatshops and the Global Economy. His other books include Making Poor Nations Rich, Entrepreneurship in the Process of Development, Housing America, Building Out of a Crisis. And the book he's going to talk about today is The Economics of Immigration. His books are really great reads. Ben writes really well. It's good stuff. You guys should buy one of his books and read it. Ben also frequently writes for the popular press, including Investor's Business Daily, Financial Times, Christian Science Monitor, and many regional outlets. He's appeared on CNN, MSNBC, Showtime, CNBC, and has been a regular guest and commentator for Fox Business Freedom Watch. So I'm really glad Ben came. Been looking forward to this for a while. And so Ben's going to talk for probably 45, 55 minutes, and then he will take questions at the end. So, so please join me in welcoming Ben Powell.
Thank you very much, Steve. It's really exciting to be here. I love what he's doing with the new center. It's an exciting time. I run a similar institute at Texas Tech University, and it's great to see them developing at other schools like this, and I look forward to collaborating with him more with the center as it continues to grow. Today, my topic is the economics of immigration, and this is a book we just published back in September, but I've been working on immigration for a better part of a decade now, and the reason that the book came about is because I've done a lot, as Steve kind of mentioned, of television type things and pop talks and newspaper columns. And what occurred to me as I'm doing it more and more is there is a debate among academics about what's a desirable immigration policy. Certainly not all economists are anywhere near in agreement of what it is. But the types of disagreements social scientists and in particular economists have are just so out of step with the disagreements that we hear in public policy, if you watch TV or listen to talk radio. The types of things being debated there just aren't that significant a debate among economists. And what the motivation for the book was, and what I'll try to do in this talk, is kind of go through what I view as the pure kind of first economic impacts of immigration, and what economic science has to say about that and where the economists agree and disagree. And then the second part, which is what are the other things, the non-economic impacts of immigration, that might raise other concerns, and what does economics have to say about some of those? But the types of things we hear debated in the public of, probably the number one that makes South Park even, if they're going to steal our jobs. This is just not something that most economists believe is anywhere near true. And I think if we could bring public discourse in line with social science, it would be much more fruitful public policy discussions that we could have where we can consider real problems that might be associated with immigration instead of the false problems that demand most of the attention. So to begin with, I'd like to make the point that immigration is just another way of doing free trade. So economists have been talking about free trade since at least the time of Adam Smith, and generally recognize that when we trade with other nations, it allows us to specialize and do what we're relatively better at, or in economic speak, doing what's in our comparative advantage. And that as a result, we're able to have a higher standard of living for ourselves, and also the people who trade with us have a higher standard of living. Well, we could have free trade in goods, we could have capital move around the world, we could have people move around the world, and we have natural resources. If any one of these is fixed in place and the other three are perfectly mobile, they can kind of sort their way around the globe in order to get the most efficient production possible. Now, of course, by their very nature, a lot of the natural resources are not perfectly mobile. They're fixed in a particular place, or it's a particular climate. Alaska is not particularly well suited to growing citrus fruit. So that's going to be one barrier to this happening. We don't have complete free trade in goods or services, although we've gotten much closer to it over the years. Same with capital mobility. And because of these other barriers, it's important that labor is able to move too. But the basic economics of international trade and labor is the exact same economics that underlies the economic case for trade in goods and services, which economists, if you're going to get them to agree on one thing, it's probably easiest to get them to agree that generally international trade increases global output and makes the world wealthier as a whole. And immigration isn't an exception to that. So also, when we just think about international trade and labor, some of the things can't be substituted with international trade in goods and services. So I can't outsource my child care to India. My lawn service can't be outsourced to Mexico. These are things that require the people who have the comparative advantage in doing them to actually be on site to provide the service. So there's simply no way to substitute around it with international trade for some of these things. Or for agricultural products, sure, you can ship the agricultural products from place to place, but each place, as I mentioned, isn't equally well suited to producing it. So sometimes you need the laborers to be able to move to the climate that's best suited for producing those particular products. So to start with, I want to just get a feel for the scale of the benefits that economists estimate could come from more open migration, because it's staggering. So right now, there's about 600 million people in the world who desire, according to surveys, to live in another country other than which they were born in, or about 14% of the world's population. For about 100 million of those, the first choice is the United States. But in the world we live in, only about 200 million people currently reside outside the nation of their birth, and it's about 40 million inside the United States. Economists who have estimated how big the global gains could be from opening more migration are just staggering. The estimates range from about 50% to 150% of world GDP, on average doubling global wealth. And that's not just like a one-time thing, that's doubled global wealth every single year going forward. It's just, there's no other economic policy out there anywhere where the gains are potentially that big. Now, part of the reason for that is because we've already got pretty good free trade in goods and services. Not perfect, but we've come a long way since the end of World War II, so the remaining gains are relatively small. But what we've had since the 19th century is a complete reversal on immigration. We went from a world where people were pretty much free to migrate to wherever they wished, to one in which virtually every country restricts severely the number of migrants who can move there. And as a result, the gains that could come from it are just much bigger. And the other part is, a lot of it is not just moving to where you have a comparative advantage, but your own skill set, what you can do with your human capital. Julian Simon called people the ultimate resource. It's the human creativity, ingenuity that they have. But a lot of that is trapped in places around the globe that have really lousy governments with lousy policies that don't respect the rule of law, that don't secure property rights, that don't give people great economic freedoms to interact in a market. And as a result, their human capital is trapped where it can't do the greatest good. When they move to another country that has better institutions, the rule of law, protection of property rights, economic freedom, it's not just that it's the person who's best suited to doing childcare or growing vegetables. It's that ingenuity gets unlocked because now they can receive the benefits from being creative and doing more. So it's partly the standard gains that you get from international trade in goods and services that we see these global gains, but a lot of it's just unlocking human creativity that's otherwise trapped. Now, there's no time in the near future, as far as I can tell, that the United States or any part of the world is going to a world of open borders. But just even modest increases in allowing people from poorer countries to move to richer countries can get big gains. Just a 5% migration of the world's poorest to richer countries would dwarf the gains that you could get from completely getting the rest of the way to complete free trade in goods and complete free trade in capital mobility. This here, it's not the low-hanging fruit because politically it's a hard fruit to grab, but what it is it's a giant fruit hanging on the tree, and even if you can slice off a portion of it, the global gains could be massive. So a lot of those gains, and I think this is fairly uncontroversial even in the general public, go to the people who migrate themselves. So we call this the place premium. So if you take a Haitian out of Haiti or a Nigerian out of Nigeria and you move them and drop them in the United States, incomes go up by an average of 1,000%. Controlling for having it be the same education, the same human capital as someone left in that country, overnight, 1,000%. There's no other development policy for the world poor like this. No amount of aid that you can send a foreign country, even institutional reform that does get better property rights and freedom in these countries, growth's a process, it takes time. This is like a magic bullet for them. They move and instantly productivity goes up massively when they're able to interact with the human capital, physical capital, and better rules that a place like the United States has. For other countries like Mexico, it's still impressive, about 150% increase, but not nearly as massive as from Nigeria or Haiti. And part of it is the Julian Simon unleashing the ultimate resource of their own creativity. But a lot of them, even if they're doing the same job, so take a taxi cab driver in Nigeria, move him to New York, and his income goes up doing the exact same task. Why? Part of it is better physical capital to work with, but that's not the whole story. It's also, if you think about it, he's providing a service, moving other people up and down the street. Where is it more valuable to move people up and down the street? Somewhere in Nigeria or in Manhattan? Moving that person up and down in the street in Manhattan creates a lot more wealth for the rest of the world. That means he's creating more wealth by moving somebody. So it's the interaction with a wealthier, more productive society that tends to boost their incomes. Now, in popular discourse, if I was talking to Lou Dobbs, which I've done before, and it's a disaster, he would hear that and say, of course, yeah, it's good for them. He's like, actually, he said this, but it's going to make America poor. We're going to turn ourselves into a third world country. He also called me an idiot and a jackass, by the way. But he refused to go live. He wanted a taped one so that he could just name call, which is cool coming from someone like him. I took it as a compliment. So when he says things like this, there's no serious economist who would agree. Economists who study the economic impact on the United States of the receiving immigrants all agree that the wealth of the receiving people in the United States also increases. Even the critics who are economists of greater immigration. So George Borhaus is probably the most prominent one. He's an economist at Harvard University. And he's estimated, using his methods with current immigrant flows, that the United States, the native born in the United States, currently benefit from the immigrants in the United States by about $40 billion per year to the native born population. Now, he's a critic of greater immigration, and ironically an immigrant himself, but his criticism is, well, we don't benefit that much. I like $40 billion, but as a percent of, 15, $17 trillion economy, 40 billion is a pretty small number. And he says, so it's not that much to give up if we have other concerns. But even here, your economist who's against immigration is saying it on net makes Americans wealthier. Now, there's reasons why his estimate might be a low range, but the other ones that people have done, you can get into the hundreds of billions of dollars, which is still modest as a percent of our overall economy. But there's good reasons that number is smaller. The most obvious one is we have major quantitative restrictions on immigration. It would be like if we lived in a world of 95% restrictions on international trade, and it said, well, look, we only benefit a little bit from international trade, so we won't hurt ourselves by cutting us off from more of it. Well, yeah, we only benefit a little because we only do it a little bit. So if the quantitative restrictions were gone, these gains could be greater. Another one is, because of the quantitative restrictions, a significant fraction, about 13 million or so of the 40 million in the United States are here illegally. But that also limits the upside of the economic value that they can create. You don't have equal access to all professions. As a result, the amount of wealth you can create is not the same as if you were here legally. And it leads to just poor skill matching between employers and employees that a legal market wouldn't have that same problem. But either way, the economists who are against immigration say, oh, yeah, there's net gains to the native-born population. And this should not be surprising, because the fundamental economics that underlies it is the exact same as international trade in goods and services. And presumably, most of you are in a business school, you probably already took a principles of economics class, if you didn't forget everything from it. You remember comparative advantage, what happens when a rich country and a poor country trade? Both become better off. Not necessarily proportionately who gets more, but both become better off than they would be otherwise. This is the same thing. So yes, the immigrants gain massively when they come, but they don't do it at our expense. It's not a pie that shrinks. They grow the pie for us, and we get a little bit better off too. So what about the jobs? I can't do the voice. They steal our jobs, or whatever it is on South Park. I think there's an important reason why there's this perception. And it's because of what the economist Frederick Bastiat called the seen and the unseen. And when an immigrant comes and performs a job, and it used to be performed by a native-born worker, you can stick a TV camera on that person, and say, I used to do this job, now I'm unemployed. Pan to construction site and you see immigrants working on it. That's the scene. It's obvious. Yes, that person did used to do that job. Yes, now immigrants do that job. But the unseen is the jobs that immigration creates. So that on net, there's no impact on the employment of the native-born or employment opportunities for the native-born population. It frees up American labor to do the things that American labor is better suited to do. But jobs are created in our economy for all sorts of reasons, because of technological changes, because of changes in resource costs, because of shifts in consumer demand. There's not the ability to stick a TV camera on a new job that was created and say that job came because American labor had been freed up elsewhere from immigrants to go into that industry now. So you get this bias in perception of the seen and the unseen. But those other ones are real, they're just statistical. If this wasn't true, just think about if we had a fixed pool of jobs. Forget about immigration for a second. Actually, here, we can make this interactive. What has happened to the US labor force since, say, 1950? Who's entered it? Yeah. The union's actually been on the decline, kind of. Who's new people into the labor force since 1950? Massive entry of women into the workforce, right? Who else? Maybe some of your parents or uncles. Baby boom generation, big increase in population there. Post-1965, also increase in immigration. This, a little bit tough to read in this size room, probably, is the size of the civilian labor force in the United States. It's close to tripled since 1950. If we had some sort of fixed pool of jobs, the unemployment rate should be massive. It doesn't matter if the person immigrated or was born or was a woman entering the workforce. If there was a fixed pool of jobs, it should be displacing people. We should have massive long-term structural unemployment. We don't. And we don't precisely because there's not a fixed pool of jobs. Our desires for goods and services are nearly limitless. When we add more people to the workforce, we create new jobs for them to go to. And they create more value for us in society elsewhere. Immigration is not about changing the total number of jobs for the native-born. It's about switching the mix of jobs for the native-born to those which they're best suited at relative to the scarcity of labor, including the international laborers. Also, a lot of these jobs that are created for the immigrants might not exist if it wasn't for immigration itself. There was a case a couple of years back where in Arizona, a lot of the lettuce crop had come to harvest, but at the time, they were having a hard time getting immigrant labor to do it, in part because of increased border restrictions. The farmers left the crops in the ground to rot and took about $1 billion worth of losses. Now, it's fashionable in the immigration debate sometimes for proponents to say, you know, immigrants will do the jobs that Americans won't do. And for critics of immigration to then say, well, yeah, but if you pay the Americans higher, they would do those jobs. I think all of these statements are true. The question is, would the job exist if the wage had to go higher? In the case of the lettuce growers, they could have bid the wages high enough that they could get, you know, how many of you at $50 an hour would be willing to take a semester off? Yeah, there's a lot of hands going. Now, it's just not profitable for the lettuce farmer to pay $50 an hour. It's better to actually just take the losses, take $1 billion of losses, and leave it in the ground. But that means the job wouldn't exist if there weren't immigrants to come in and take this. It's not simply a matter of bidding the wages higher. Which leads to the next objection. So, okay, if they don't impact our number of jobs, they've got to push down wages, right? This is power paragraphs, we'll skip those. Basically, it's a summary from the book, say that, yeah, the studies on this just don't find a big effect on jobs or on wages. So, when you write, Steve mentioned I write newspaper columns and stuff. When you write popular columns, it generates hate mail. In particular, when you write defending sweatshops, that generates hate mail, but nothing generates hate mail like immigration. And in one column, I made the basic point that I've made to you so far, that they don't impact the total number of jobs for us, and they don't push down wages. And I get this one nasty one, which usually I just delete, but I had a few cocktails that night and came home and I was like, oh, I'll have some fun with this. And responded, and then the next day he wrote back, it was more reasonable. We went back and forth a few times. And when it ended, he said, would you mind if we published our correspondence on my website dedicated to immigration? Then I had to go back and look at actually the drunk email I wrote and make sure that was okay. And then I was like, yeah, actually, okay, just don't edit anything. And here, include this one paragraph with these references to the scholarly literature that backs up what I'm saying. And he told me that the article was going to be called "Economist Denies the Laws of Supply and Demand," which is kind of a funny thing to accuse an economist of. But he actually looked at the reference and they changed the title so it was "Economics Profession Denies the Laws of Supply and Demand." It's also the only time I've been featured on a neo-Nazi website, to my knowledge, but because he was attacking me, it was kind of fun. But this is the basic point he was making. You've all seen this, most all of you probably, if you've taken the principles of economics class, have seen a lot of things like this. It's a simple supply and demand diagram. He's like, look, immigration increases the supply of labor, pushes it out. So if you know supply and demand, you got to understand, well, look, it's going to push down the wages. And actually, he didn't get this part, but the job part. Well, total jobs do increase, but if we look, this is the native-born supply curve of labor. This is plus immigration. So really, compared to here, the native-born decrease the amount of jobs that they have. So therefore, you just don't understand supply and demand. Obviously, immigration is going to decrease the number of jobs for native and push down everybody's wages. Fine as far as it goes, but we can keep doing this still at principles level analysis so we can turn it out, because it's not just the supply of labor that gets affected. Do immigrants come here and consume nothing? No, they demand goods and services. Well, if they demand goods and services, someone has to produce those goods and services. To do that, they have to hire laborers. So now, the supply of labor does shift out, but so does the demand for labor. If it's exactly proportional, wage rates would be unchanged, native-born employment would be unchanged. If it's more than proportional, it would push up wage rates and native employment. If it's less than proportionate, there would be a downward push and a decrease in employment, but not as big as what's shown here. It's an empirical question. It's not simply a theoretical certainty that this effect must happen, because you've got two things going on at once in this graph by the very nature of immigration. That's part of the problem. The other part, though, is it even right to say it's the supply of labor? This makes everybody homogeneous. In fact, the whole case for international trade based on comparative advantage is based on people having different relative abilities and opportunity costs. If immigrants are not exactly like the average laborer in this diagram, well, then there's going to be different effects. Are they complements or are they substitutes? This framework's just assuming they're straight substitutes. But immigrants tend to have different skill sets than the native-born population. If you think of a spectrum from like high skill to low skill, and then like the proportion of the population. In the United States, the proportion of the population that's very low skill, as a proxy will say, doesn't have a high school diploma. It's fairly small. Most of the population has a high school degree, some college experience, maybe a college degree. A very small part of the population is very high skill. If we're going to use, admittedly this might be a stretch, but if we're going to use PhD as a proxy for high skill, a very small percentage of the native-born attain a PhD. If we're going to put a shape to this, it looks kind of like a diamond. What about immigrants? Disproportionately, lots of very low-skilled. Also, disproportionately, and you can do this, you walk around your university, look at the names on the office doors, disproportionately, a very high percentage of the people with PhDs in the United States are foreign-born. Immigration tends to look more like an hourglass. Our population more like a diamond. But this tells you that they're not direct substitutes for us. They have different skill sets than the native-born population, which means they should be freeing us up to do the things we're relatively better at. So they're complements, not substitutes. Now, what's striking to me is a lot of people say, okay, well, high-skilled immigration, we understand, they bring their skills here and they're good. But it's these low-skilled. It seems to me what we have a real shortage of relative to global supply is low-skilled labor in the United States. When Steve and I have both been down to University of Francisco Marroquín in Guatemala, a wonderful institution. All the professors there, they'll have house servants, nannies, gardeners. They probably don't make what we make here in the United States, but the supply of low-skilled labor there is just tremendous, so it's very inexpensive for them to have it, and it makes that person better off to have the job. How many of them would be better off if they could be performing that service in the United States? And what would it do to the productivity of the native-born in the United States? Think about just the empirical regularity that many women take time off from the workforce when they have children. This is one of the reasons why when they get reemployed later, they earn less on average than men. It's because it's time out of the workforce. Well, if we had more of the global poor here to provide nannying service, would some of them stay in the workforce? Almost certainly. And what would that do? The low-skilled labor might be doing a low-skilled task, but it's freeing up an American who had high skills, who is going to withdraw them from the labor force, to instead doing more. That increases our productivity, our wages of our native-born population. So it's not simply a substitution effect. What else? Specialization and division of labor, classic Adam Smith. It's limited by the extent of the market. Now, some of the extent of the market is how you trade internationally, but it's also how many people you can trade with locally. So as you have a greater concentration of people in any one area, all the more narrow can be the specialization of any one, which is going to increase the productivity as everybody specializes more narrowly. The restaurant selection in Lubbock, where I'm from, is limited by the extent of the market, about a 200,000 metro population, a little bit more, versus Manhattan, much finer specialization of labor when it comes to services there. So all of these effects lead it to not having a general effect on the wages of native-born workers. Where the economists have their debate on this is about high school dropouts. And does low-skilled immigration impact the wages of people without a high school diploma in the United States? Here's the range of the debate. Positive 1% to about negative 8%. So all of this, you hear on the talk news, they're going to impoverish us. No, economists find net economic benefits, no effect on jobs. Wages, oh yeah, here's our vigorous debate. Is it slightly positive or is it negative 8% for those people without a high school diploma? And how long does it last? So most of them find that it's temporary and later wages go back up. Why? Because even then, just having not a high school diploma versus a low-skill immigrant who comes in without one, you're still not direct substitutes. There's one piece of human capital that you probably differ substantially on: English language skills. So yes, you might initially get displaced from the back of the restaurant working in the kitchen, but then you end up in the front of the restaurant working as a waiter because you have a language skill that's different than the immigrants who came, and then your earnings can go back up. So the debate is just, is it slightly positive or is it negative for those high school dropouts, and how long does it last before they're able to recover from it? So what I've done so far is do what I think think of as the standard kind of economics of immigration. This is the stuff that I don't find particularly controversial. The next things are, how is it different from international trade in goods and services? Because labor is different. Goods don't take their skills out of a poor country. So when the poor country sends goods to a rich country, the skilled worker who made them is still there. So there can't be a fallback effect on that country. So what happens when the laborer leaves? Goods can't consume welfare or other government benefits in the destination country when they get there. Goods don't need to assimilate, learn a language, interact in a culture. Goods can't commit crime or terrorist acts. Can't engage in political activism, change the institutions of the country where they go to. These are all ways in which people are different. So let's consider some of these and what economics has to say about them. I will say, though, to the extent that we see problems in some of these areas, go back to the beginning of the talk of how massive the gains are, global gains are to from immigration. If we're talking a doubling of world GDP, even if immigration has some other problems, how many of them could be solved by taking some of that doubling of GDP and allocating it towards addressing the problem, rather than just saying no immigration so we don't have to deal with this problem? My suspicion is, if the gains are anywhere near where economists have estimated them, you can cure most of these. All right, so origin countries. So the concept is brain drain. So there's immigration, smart people from a poor country leave, go to the richer country, but that impoverishes the country they leave behind. A couple problems with this. On net, doesn't seem to be the evidence that the countries get poorer as a result of their leaving. The intuition behind it's surely sound. Smart people leaving is going to be a little bit bad for the country in and of itself that they leave. But what else happens? Well, one, instead of just brain drain, there's brain gain. How many of the smart people there who left only became smart and educated and highly skilled because of the prospect of emigration? If that's what incentivizes them to gain higher skills in the first place, the country gets the temporary use of their services until they emigrate, but they wouldn't have had any of their services otherwise because the person would have never built the skills in the first place. The kind of mistake here is looking at the wealth that the immigrant creates where they arrive versus what would have they created if they had stayed at home in a lousy environment. What's lost in that origin country is not equal to the gain that is found in the destination country. These two things are vastly different. And that origin country gets them for a little while before they move. I think probably the more important one of this, though, is remittances. So official development assistance has been a straight-up disaster, I think, for its now about 70-year history. World Bank loans, IMF loans, these haven't promoted development in poorer parts of the world for the most part. And the flows of what they are just teeny compared to remittances. About 100 billion compared to 400 billion. Remittances just dwarf it. The advantage of remittances is when immigrants go to another country and then send money home themselves, they're not sending it through the corrupt governments that are responsible for the bad rules in these places. It doesn't end up in a Swiss bank account. Instead, it goes to friends and family members that they know, and that they get feedback from other friends and family about how they're spending it back there. So there's more local knowledge that's mobilized, and you avoid the corrupt governments and are actually able to do more good. And precisely because they create so much more value in their destination country than they could have in their origin country, it creates the pool of wealth that the remittances are possible. Once we take this into account, this compensates a whole lot for the brain drain effect. Finally, it also facilitates trade. So when countries have a higher immigrant share in their population from a particular country, then they tend to trade more with that country, and international trade helps improve wealth. And for that matter, there's a transfer of knowledge and technology. As more immigrants are in a place like America that has a little bit better freedom, some of that knowledge translates back to their friends and family back in that country and could help promote institutional change there. All right, fiscal impacts. So not just narrow economics of making the pie bigger, but what about government budgetary things? How do immigrants impact the fiscal situation? If you pay attention to any policy studies that come out on this, you'll see all sorts of wild claims in one direction or another. Most of those are pretty lousy methodologies that they use. So there's a couple things that you need to do a responsible study on this. You can't just add up the taxes an immigrant pays today and the services they consume today. That's not a fiscal impact. If an immigrant comes here and their employer makes more money because they're able to hire them, that employer pays higher taxes because he's made more money. That is part of a fiscal impact. So any reasonable study has to do dynamic effects. So yes, the taxes an immigrant pays, the services they consume, but then how much did the pie get bigger in the United States as a result of immigration? How much of that generated corporate profits that become corporate taxes? That has to go in. So you got to look at the ripple effect through the economy. That's one part. The other part, static versus dynamic. So I have a 6-year-old boy. He's a welfare queen so far. He's not generated a single tax dollar. He goes to the public elementary school now. He's traveled on government roads. It's a fiscal drain. In fact, I'm probably talking to a room full of welfare queens right now, because most of you are 22 or younger, haven't paid a significant amount of income taxes, but have gone through a public schooling system. You're all fiscal drains. Is this a rational way to calculate my little boy or you? No. Any responsible way would say, okay, well, how much do they consume in tax services today? How much in tax revenue are they going to generate in the future when they're actually workers? And then how much, if we assume Social Security and Medicare is still going to exist, which maybe isn't a very good assumption, how much are they going to consume later in government benefits? Then we look over that life cycle and say, how much are they a fiscal drain or a fiscal gain? Just taking a snapshot in time isn't a realistic picture. So an immigrant who gets here today and who might consume some, and it's really not actually welfare benefits because they don't have access to them. It's more demands on local schools and hospitals, things like that, maybe policing, where you get more of your impacts. So if they're a drain today, you have to also forecast what's their earnings over time, what tax revenue is going to be generated, then what are they going to take later. Partially, immigrants are a good deal because almost all of them that come here of working age don't have any of the schooling up front, so you get a lifetime of working before taking benefits later. But of course, then you can count the immigrant's kids. If an immigrant comes and has a kid, he goes to the school. Well, if we're going to count that kid's schooling as a drain on that immigrant, we also have to count that kid's working later, just like my little welfare queen. But next thing you know, as you start doing this, it becomes really problematic to calculate this. Because if you're going to count that kid, now we're forecasting 80 years out what government benefits are going to be in the future, what marginal tax rates are going to be for him over his lifetime. For that matter, are we going to do his kid's kid? all of a sudden you're sitting there in 1800 and trying to figure out what the US government budget's going to look like in 2000. It's just patently absurd. But that said, we know we're supposed to be doing something like that if we're doing a reasonable calculation, because it's wrong to just count my kid as a tax drain today. So the studies that do this, that are reasonable, try to do both the dynamic, the ripple effects, and generational of how this impacts over time. The result is some of them are negative and some of them are positive, but they're all pretty small. They're clustered right around 0. There's just not big effects one way or another, with a whole bunch of different modeling assumptions that people throw into this. You have to make pretty absurd conclusions, pretty absurd assumptions to get radically negative or radically positive outcomes out of this. What you do have is a little bit of difference between local and national, because a lot of the tax revenue is generated at the national level, but a lot of the services are consumed at the local level, so you can have individual cities that have a big immigrant influx that get a negative fiscal burden through their schools and their hospitals and such. To me, though, this isn't a criticism of immigration, it's a criticism of how governments do taxing and spending. Readjust your fiscal policies to keep more of the tax revenue local or more of the services national. It's not a problem of immigration per se. The real problem here is there's spillovers from one person to another. This is true whether we birth the babies or whether people cross the border. For efficient decision making, what we want to do is internalize as many of these spillovers as possible, make people pay for it in the marketplace, and then it will lead to more optimal decision making. But I think the last point on this, though, is fiscal policy is changeable. To the extent that there's fiscal drains, you can change fiscal policy. Now, I don't favor some of these policies, but to the extent one's objection is, how about an immigration surtax? Each person who's an immigrant has to pay 5 percentage points higher in income taxes with no bottom exemption. You could take that money and dedicate it to whichever fiscal shortfall that you saw. Do you think most of the world's poor would still take that deal in coming to the United States? Yeah. So this is what we call like keyhole solutions, small little solutions instead of blanket restriction against everybody. You just adjust policy a little bit to take care of the negative effect that you see somewhere else. Assimilation. Most of the complaints that you can hear about immigration today, you can go back and you can pick it out against the Irish, the Italians, the other immigrants from Eastern Europe when they came to the United States. They're the same set of complaints. The assimilation, Jake Vigdor's done some cool work on this. It looks a whole lot like the 19th century immigrants in terms of intermarriage, language skills, things like that. And more recently, it's even shifted. This here is a graph. It's an assimilation index that's using intermarriage rates and language acquisition skills. And it's taking the cohorts of when the people arrive. So in the late 70s, that's this group. If you get all the way up to 100 on an index, you're statistically unable to be recognized from a native-born person in the population. And all of them, it's upward trending, but notice what's happening. The slopes of the lines are getting steeper in this last immigrant group. Actually, not only is it steeper, but they've surpassed the immigrant group that came before them in terms of assimilation. Why? This is the post-recession immigrants. Immigration changed to the United States after that. You'd never know it listening to Donald Trump speeches, but what is net migration from Mexico right now?
Negative.
Most years since the recession, it's been negative. More people have gone back to Mexico than are coming to the United States. If Trump builds his wall, he better make sure there's a door on this side of it. Otherwise, he's going to be containing people in the United States rather than keeping them out. Why? A couple of reasons. One, the downturn in the United States, less economic opportunity here. Two, relatively strong growth in Mexico, less reason to leave. Three, and this is true of the prior immigration waves that we had under more open immigration policy, is the demographic shift has already occurred. So what you find is a poor country, as it starts to get wealthier, fertility rates don't decrease proportionally. Why do you have lots of kids when you're in a poorer country? To help you earn money, to help support you in your retirement, and also just if you want 3 adult children, you probably have to have 4 or 5 to make sure that you actually have 3 in the end, because infant mortality is high, child mortality is high. Well, as you start getting economic growth, wealth and health go together. So fewer babies die. That's a good thing. But people's reproductive habits don't change as quickly. They're still having lots of kids, and you get this kind of population bombs that occur. And then slowly over time, those fertility rates adjust down as people get used to the fact that children make it through childhood and become adults. This is what's happened in Mexico. Fertility rates have been dropping significantly since the 1960s. There's like about a 20-year lag when you think about it, from dropping fertility rates to people who are entering the workforce age. And that demographic shift is now occurring. Most of that thrust of the big population from becoming a slightly richer country has already happened. So why is the assimilation rate higher? It's a different composition, largely Asian immigrants rather than Mexican. Why would their assimilation rates be higher? Well, just think of straight costs and benefits economic terms. The larger the immigrant population of the same language skill as the people migrating, the lower the benefits to language assimilation to start with, because you can already interact with lots of people in that language. If you're the first person who speaks Spanish who moves to the United States, the benefits of learning English are very, very high. If you're the 13 millionth, the benefits aren't as high, so you don't need to assimilate as quickly. So as you change the immigrant composition here, that's what's happening there. This here, I think, is the frontier of the new debate on immigration. And it's, what if they impact our institutions? So that whole place premium, they earn so much more when they come to the United States. It's driven by the fact that we have good institutions here. So yeah, it's that we have more human capital to interact with, more physical capital to interact with. But the really important factor is, although it's on the decline, still in the United States compared to the rest of the world, we have a reasonably good rule of law, protection of private property rights, and a fair degree of economic freedom compared to everybody else. I kind of think of it as like being the tallest dwarf, but all the same, still relatively better than the other places. What if these people bring with them not just their private skills, human capital, but their kind of public human capital? And they come here and bring in cultural beliefs that are anti-freedom, particularly anti-economic freedom. And while they don't have the right to vote, that doesn't mean that they can't impact the political process other ways, and eventually maybe they become citizens and do vote. Might they try to bring in the lousy institutions, either consciously or unconsciously, from their origin countries to the United States? If they do that, they're going to be less productive when they're here, but more importantly, the ability of all of us who are native born to interact, our environments got worse, and now we're less productive. And if that's the case, maybe these doubling of world GDP isn't real. Those numbers all of a sudden go down. Maybe they turn negative. Then this whole case evaporates. This is the forefront, I think, of the debate in economics now. Again, vastly different than what you hear on talk radio. And George Borjas, the same man I mentioned earlier who's a critic of greater immigration, he recently published a paper making this claim, and he made, I think it was 6 different modeling scenarios of how much of their social capital will they bring that destroys our productivity in the West, and what it would do to the global gains and maybe even erase or turn them negative. Now, he didn't give any evidence for it, he just made it up actually, but with fancy math, so it looks cool. But there was no evidence for it. Economists really haven't studied it that much. But what I saw from him inspired me and some colleagues to make a first stab at this. We took the Economic Freedom of the World annual report. This is published each year, and it attempts to measure the degree of economic freedom in all the countries around the world that they can get the data for. Kind of 5 broad areas of how big your government is, how secure are your property rights, how good your money, how free are you to trade internationally, how much does the government regulate businesses, labor markets, credit markets. And there's a huge literature that's developed in the 25 years or so, 20 years I guess, that this study's been being published, that shows countries that have higher economic freedom, have higher incomes, grow faster, have longer life expectancies, lower infant mortality, higher literacy. Basically pick whichever outcome you like, and it's associated with this measure of economic freedom. So my colleagues and I did is we said, okay, well, let's take a look at how immigrants impact economic freedom then. Do they actually come and bring their human capital, their kind of public good human capital with them, and pollute the native populations? So we looked at, I think, 110 countries from 1990 through 2010 when we could get the data of when a country had a bigger total stock of immigrants in 1990, what did that do to the subsequent 20 years change in economic freedom? When they had a bigger flow over that 20 years, what did that do to economic freedom? And what did stocks and flows combined do? We were expecting actually to find nothing. The stocks and flows varied quite a bit. I mean, from some countries that are essentially 0% immigrant to I think Kuwait was the highest. It's like 70% immigrant. So substantial variation among the countries here. What we found though is that actually higher immigrant stocks and flows were associated with slightly higher levels of subsequent changes in economic freedom afterwards. So rather than bringing their human capital with them that pollutes us, the place has actually got a little bit more free. So this was our first stab at investigating this. The mechanisms through it, there's a few that you could think about. One is, does it impact how the native-born population desires their policies to be? I don't think it's an accident that we see bigger welfare states in more homogeneous countries. A bunch of blonde, blue-eyed Swedes don't mind subsidizing each other. But when a country becomes more heterogeneous and people are more different, people don't like subsidizing, for right or wrong, people tend to not like subsidizing people who they don't view as like them. As a result, you have smaller welfare states. So there's immigration. So Milton Friedman's a famous free market economist who said, it's just obvious open immigration and a welfare state are incompatible. I think that's probably true. But that doesn't tell us that, therefore, it's a case against immigration. It tells us immigration is going to make it a lot harder to have a big welfare state. If you're someone who loves freedom, that's a good thing. So it's going to put pressure on it, kind of a blowback of the native-born population wanting to shrink that. That's one mechanism. The other is, I don't think it's necessarily the case that immigrants bring their statist values from their lousy governments here. They move and they like the better environment, and why would they want to return it to what their home country was? So I had sent this paper to Professor Borhaus, and he wrote me back and he said, well, that's all fine, but that comes from a world of management. Now, by the way, in his article he wrote, we know little, parentheses, read nothing about how immigrants could impact our institutions, and then he made up 6 scenarios all in the same direction. I think it's worthwhile to at least say, where does the line start? Now, his comment was basically, it comes from a world of managed migration systems. I don't know that this would be the same with large-scale migrations of people that's not managed. That's fine, but we've got the start of the line, and it's headed in one direction. He assumed the whole thing must be in the other. There might be a tipping point. And then what he said was, I'd like to see a natural experiment with open immigration that has a large exogenous shock of immigrants come in and what it does to institutions. I said, that's what I'm working on right now, because there's a good candidate, Israel. Israel has open immigration to worldwide Jews, has since 1951 their law of return. What happened in 1990? Shift in Soviet policy allowing greater emigration, and then the subsequent collapse of the Soviet Union. You get massive migration from the former Soviet bloc into Israel throughout the 1990s. About a 20% increase in their population due to immigration from those countries alone. I think that qualifies as, 1, natural experiment. Israel didn't change their policy. 2, 20% change in population, significant. And in terms of institutions, the second the Jews step back in Israel, they have citizenship, including voting rights. So immediately the immigrants became part of the political process there. What happened during the decade? Israel improved by close to 2 points in this economic freedom index. That's a massive increase in freedom. And it jumped maybe about 50 countries in the rankings. So I'm working on the mechanism of how that changed from immigrants coming in to impacting policy, because it wasn't blowback on the welfare state. I think it's predominantly through the views of the immigrants themselves, who didn't, quote, bring their communist social capital, but instead brought anti-communism with them of wanting a better way of life. All the same, when I think there's important debates to be had about immigration, instead of yakking about jobs or something like that, this is the important one. Because back to how do we deal with other problems? If we're talking about a doubling of world GDP, you can deal with most of the problems. This cuts to the heart of, do we really double world GDP? If it some way impacts the production function, it could lower that output that the world gains, then we don't have the money to deal with the other problems. So I think this is the important stuff to debate. Then finally, I'll end with this. It's just that, what is optimal immigration policy? And I should say, by the way, I'll save it for questions, but I've been very US-centric in this talk. I'm happy to take questions about dealing with the crisis going on in Europe and stuff like that, but we're here in the United States, and most of the concern here is about the US, so I was focused that way. But what's optimal immigration policy? What's the right quantity? Who should be let in? I don't know. What's the optimal immigration from Massachusetts to Texas? I don't know. We're roughly at it, though. I migrated from Massachusetts to Texas a little over 3 years ago. How did we do it? I had an employer in Massachusetts who was paying me. I had a job offer in Texas, paid me more. I had a cost of living in Massachusetts. I had a cost of living in Texas. I had to consider moving away from family, moving outside of Red Sox Nation, missing my Patriots and my Celtics, although I'm going to catch Rick Pitino here tonight, so he used to be the Celtics coach. I weigh these things, and then I make my choice. Other people do as well. Differences in government-provided services between Texas, Massachusetts, or any other state are relatively modest. So for the most part, we get optimal migration between US states. Basically, what do we need to find the right number? and for that matter, the right mix, we need price signals. We need employment offers and costs of living and let people sort it out. It's a market. Absent a market, we do not know the optimal quantity. So what's the right quantity from Mexico to the United States? From Jordan to the United States? From Syria to the United States? I don't know any of these numbers. What we need is people to have to support themselves when they come here, and then allowing employers here to make employment offers and then make decisions of migration or not migration, and we'll get to roughly the right number. Now, right now, might there be some welfare state benefits and other things that would push you to more than the optimal number? Yeah, probably. But right now, do we get massively less than the optimal number? Obviously, that's why so many are trying to come illegal even. So I think if we're going to try to approach getting this right number, it means drastically reducing quantitative restrictions on immigration. Then the question is, if we still have quantitative, by the way, this isn't just a straight open borders type thing. There's nothing about this that says you can just willy-nilly cross the Rio Grande or anything else. As long as we have a U.S. government that have no quantitative restrictions but still have legal checkpoints so you can try to screen for known terrorists, people who have contagious diseases, whatever the other concerns along these margins are. But just not have blanket quantitative restrictions. If you're going to have, even to where we still have this debate about institutions, no one argues that we're anywhere near the tipping point of them destroying institutions, which means even Borjas's recent case against open borders is still can be a case for vastly relaxed immigration compared to the baseline. But then if you're going to have any quantitative standards, our immigration planners are no better than the Soviet planners at planning markets. We can't plan the international market for laborers. The Canadian point system doesn't do it. By the way, I'm currently ineligible to migrate to Canada. I'm not a real doctor. If you were a medical doctor, then you could go. But the point system doesn't know how to do this. We need supply and demand forces in the marketplace. And in fact, we have people who want to be reunited with family members, and you have employers who want to hire. How do you reconcile these competing demands? If we're going to have quantitative restrictions, the best way to allocate the visas is via a market. Create an auction market. Allow employers here to bid for it, workers abroad who want to move here to bid for it, family members who are here who want to be reunited and just bring a family member over, allow them to bid for the permits. Heck, let immigration restrictionists buy a permit and burn it if they want. If you do that, then you can harness the knowledge of a marketplace of which people can create the greatest value by moving here. But absent that, there's no central planner who knows it. So my general point is the gains from this here are potentially massive. We vastly restricted in the United States that makes much of the world's poor much worse off, and it also makes us poorer as a result. We'd be better off if we could increase flows and use markets as much as possible to do it. So with that, I'll wrap up and take questions for the remainder of the time. Thank you.
Question, raise your hand. We have people with boom mics, and I'll bring the mic to you and ask your question.
Questions? There you go, in the middle.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, what are your thoughts on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and let's see if you relate it to like immigration as well.
I'm not sure if I can speak to the details of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but I'd say most trade agreements in general, that there's problematic things with all free trade agreements. A free trade agreement should go something like, I agree not to tax or put quantitative restrictions on your stuff. You do the same to me. Then maybe we need like a page of non-regulatory discrimination. And in practice, what you see is big documents with lots of pages, which means there's tons of exceptions that aren't free trade within those documents. That said, I think the multilateral negotiations that have gone on since World War II pretty clearly have increased trade between countries for the better, even with their drawbacks in them. I would expect that this latest one would probably be another one related to that that'll marginally make trade better between the two continents, but probably has tons of problems with it. And it almost certainly ignores free trade and labor. I would like all the WTO agreements to have more things about free trade and labor with them. In the back.
Thank you for your excellent presentation, and I have great sympathy for the perspective you presented. How about reflecting on the problem with presenting the perspective that you just presented when you've got Jeff Sessions, who thinks that the H-1B1 should be limited to basically 1,000 a year. You've got Sean Hannity, you've got the right wing, you got Mike Gallagher, you've got the whole right wing radio format against you. How are you going to present the balanced view of free trade and immigration when the prevailing commentary is strictly against this?
You know, I'm not sure I have a good answer to that, and I'm certainly open to suggestions. The problem that you lay out is correct. I think that what I've tried to do with this the best I can is at least try to bring the economic rationality of what are real problems and what are false problems to it. What you encounter a lot of times with people with very hard positions on this is often their stated reason is not their real reason for their policy, and as you keep knocking legs out from the stool underneath them, they don't change their position, they change what their problem is, and some people you're just not going to convince. But what I try to do is just get more rational discourse to those people who are willing to listen. I mean, I debated the national chairman of the Minutemen one time on the radio, the group who privately patrols the border. And actually, I've never had a debate that was more fun than this, because you could just like lead them into each one. I talk about the net economic benefits to the native born, but then just end with, of course, I didn't say anything about jobs. And he's like, yes, that's the problem, jobs. Then you smash him on jobs and say, but I didn't say about wages. Yes, that's the problem, wages. So then I'm like, really? Like, you're getting hooked right along here, buddy. Don't take the bait. But it just kept switching every time. What's the problem? And for some people, you're just not going to make any inroads with that. Yes, sir.
You did have time to comment on one important point that you did show, that is the impact of immigrants on non-economic side of life, such as crime, terrorism, and the like. And that's the trade-off I'm interested to hear your opinion on, because with Europe having huge troubles with San Bernardino, you have to weigh the non-economic side of immigration against the benefits of integration itself. And one other thing here, longer-term impact on institutions from immigration. You say it's positive or close to zero on economic institutions, but why would then, say, Democratic Party be so much interested in bringing in more immigrants as potential voters? The impact on political institutions from immigration maybe is to be considered as well. So generally, economic benefits that we say, that workers and others say maybe long-term is pretty small in the U.S. You have to compare those small benefits to maybe large and growing non-economic forces.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that question. That's a good one. It's got a few parts to it. First, just at the very end, the relatively modest benefits to the existing population, that's from existing immigrant flows. So those benefits get bigger if we have bigger flows coming in. I think the crime and terrorism question is an important one. When it comes to terrorism, first of all, as long as we're going to have legal checkpoints, I think we should be screening for people with affiliations with radical groups that could be associated with terrorism. It doesn't seem to me, though, that immigration is the main channel that's any different unless we're going to close our borders to tourism, to students, and other things, because a lot of terrorists if the terrorists could sneak past the immigration visas, they could also sneak past the tourist visas, the student visas, and other ways into the country. So it's not a fundamental change. For crime, I think we do have to be concerned with this. Part of it, though, is if we are getting massive global gains, can we use some of that to deal with crime associated with it? The other part is, we don't have to let people stay who commit crimes. Instead of incarcerating here, make any immigration offer contingent upon respecting person and property. So I'm not worried about nonviolent crimes or things that I don't really think should be crimes, but let's talk about like murders, rapes, thefts, things like that. Do any offer to come here. Maybe you and your family are. That sounds maybe harsh to some people, but is it any harsher than saying you can never come here because you might commit a crime? Seems to me that it's a relative improvement. The Europe part that you bring up, I think, is an important one, because they have much more difficulty assimilating immigrants and dealing with crime and enclaving than the United States does. And I don't think it's fundamentally the immigrants themselves who are that much different in Europe. It's the institutional environment that they come into in Europe that's different. For one, a number of the countries have laws that prohibit refugee status people from working. So now Syrian refugees who come in, you can't work and support yourself. By definition, you're going to be on the government dole and in some sort of camp. This doesn't lead to you integrating into society the same way. And breeds resentment of the people who are there who have to finance you as well. So the easiest switch, and to me it's a complete no-brainer. You've got these people who are refugees who have come. Why wouldn't you let them serve you? Because you have mistaken notions about jobs and wages stuff that underlie that policy. But as a result, then those people become more dependent and also more likely to commit crimes and stuff like that to support themselves. Even the legal ones where they are allowed to work, two problems in Europe that aren't as bad in the United States. The first one is high minimum wages relative to productivity. So if you have high minimum wages but low-skilled workers come in, they can't get a job because they're not as productive as that minimum wage. But then second, and this is particularly a problem for Europe, not the United States, it's just worker dismissal laws. It's very hard to fire an employee in a lot of these countries. As a result, employers aren't willing to take a chance on hiring a new immigrant, or for that matter, a young person. It's one of the reasons why youth unemployment rates and under 25 unemployment rates are really high in Europe. So imagine, like for our students here, imagine, here's your situation. If you want to go on a date with someone, you have to promise men, know through other things very well that you ever go on a date with and marry in the first place. That's essentially the position employers are in a lot of European countries. If once I hire a worker, I can never get one of them, who am I going to hire? People with a long-term employment record in this country that I already know what I can expect. That means you don't take chances on young people, you don't take chances on immigrants. If immigrants can't get jobs, what do? Enclave into neighborhoods, try to support themselves, resent the society that's not integrating them into the labor force. Society resent their enclaving and resenting them. Tensions get bigger, and you deal with a set of problems that just aren't as severe in the United States because our markets are more flexible to integrate them. I think a lot of, not all, but a lot of Europe's problems are just homegrown and labor market policy there rather than something with immigration per se. But I do think the concerns about crime and stuff are real, and that if we have these big global games, we should direct some of them to dealing with instances of crime, and there's no reason why we can't deport people who do commit crimes. It seems much more humane to deport those who commit crimes than prohibit everybody from coming because they might commit a crime. Yes, sir.
We had a guest speaker a few weeks ago that talked about the age of the population growing. Do you think it'd be concerned about the age of the immigrants that come over?
Yeah, immigrants tend to be younger than the population on the whole. So actually, most people would view this as a benefit of immigration. I think of it more as a cost. The entitlement program, Social Security, Medicare in the United States is fundamentally bankrupt. If you believe economist Lawrence Kotlikoff's estimates, it's $200 trillion in total debt if we include all the future liabilities. These things are essentially a Ponzi scheme that require more new workers coming into them to support existing workers. Immigration extends the life of these programs. Doesn't fully solve it, but it brings the new workers in that helps prolong it. Most people would consider that a benefit. I think the sooner we get rid of Social Security and Medicare, the better. So I view it as a little bit of a cost of immigration, but I'm probably the minority in that opinion. Other questions? In the back, over there.
Yeah, I don't know.
She's coming.
You said that the GDP, a raise in GDP, how does that affect the classes? Is that proportional throughout or is it non-proportional? Because you mentioned the skill sets of immigrants being hourglass shaped.
Yep.
And natural-born citizens being diamond shaped. Aren't young immigrants that go through our school systems, wouldn't it more mimic the diamond shape? So pretty much how will the classes be affected by the raise in GDP?
Yeah, so over time, the immigrants tend to take on more of a shape that looks like existing population of the United States as their children go through the school system and stuff like that. The general distributional effect, it's people who own assets and capital clearly benefit. And those who most directly compete with the workers are the ones who might lose in the short run. That tends to be those without a high school diploma in the United States, which also correlates with not owning a house or not owning stocks, other things that go up in value with immigration. But your average middle class in the United States still benefits from it. People really haven't done that much work on the top of the diamond of the PhD, because no one really cares about PhDs competing with other PhDs, except for like the adjunct movement, who's all mad at stuff all the time, it seems. But otherwise, there could be some direct competition there, but I don't worry about foreign-born economics PhDs competing with me in the least, in part because we still have a different skill set. We might both be able to run the same regression, but most of them can't give a public lecture, so I'll still get hired to come out here and talk to Steve's group. Other questions in the back?
So I agree with my esteemed colleague, Dr. Irvin, about dealing with some of the folks on the right and some of their questions about your view. But do you also get some pushback on the other side, who is going to argue that, wait a minute, all of these models that you have assume infinite resources, and that more free trade and more GDP, more global growth is going to allow big, evil, capitalist companies to come in and exploit and pillage the Earth's resources? And how do you deal with that?
Yeah, I have dealt with that one before too. Dick Lamb, the former governor of Colorado, he and I debated, and this was one of his objections to it. At first I told him, listen, Dick, I'm not talking about birthing more babies, I'm talking about moving them around the globe to different places. And when we look at the environment in origin countries, environmental protection is often fairly lax. There's something we know as the Kuznets curve in economics, whereas GDP goes up, environmental quality goes down for a while, but then after you hit, I think it's around $5,000 per capita, environmental quality starts improving again. And we're taking a lot of people out of those very poor countries and moving them into places where we treat the environment better. So it's not clear cut to me that there's necessarily a negative environmental effect when we look at the institutions in which they're going to operate. Then there's the more fundamental, the world's running out of resources. If this increases production, that's bad. First, I like to point out to them that they're fundamentally anti-human. What they're saying is that there's poor humans on the globe who are suffering today who could be made better off, and you're saying, no, the globe is better off if you suffer and have your children die and remain illiterate. That doesn't convince them, but it usually convinces a reasonable person who is listening to them. Second, beyond that, I think it's wrong. I've got a two-word answer for anybody who tells me the world is running out of something. The first word is bull. You can guess what the second word is. As long as it's private property. Because if it's private property, as you start running out of it, what happens to its price? Price goes up. That means you economize on it, you use less of it. And similarly, at the same time, the returns to any entrepreneur who creates a substitute for it go up, so profit incentive increases innovation. Then you don't actually run out of it, you move on. What we could run out of are, very specific things where we can't have private property in. I'm worried that we'll run out of tuna in my lifetime, and I love fatty tuna sushi. It's like chapstick on your lips, it's so fatty and good. But they range across the whole ocean, and nobody owns them, so as a result, as price goes higher, you get more overfishing of them that depletes the stock. So very specific things, but this isn't like a general comment about the world's running out of resources if we make more GDP. No, the ultimate resource is human ingenuity. And what we have, unfortunately, is a lot of human ingenuity trapped in places with lousy rules where they can't use it. We move them to a richer country, it frees their minds to create more value with any existing stock of other natural resources that we have. So I think it's a fundamentally mistaken worldview of what the globe can support that doesn't take into account the economic system in which it operates in and the human ingenuity. And it's fundamentally also just anti-human. All right, with that, I thank you all. It's been fun today.
All right, a couple announcements. Thank you, Dick.
Thanks, Steve.
Very good. All right. So, give a shirt for the John H. Schnatter Center for Free Enterprise.
Wear it to the game.
A couple things. If you're here for extra credit, or somebody with a patch in the back that says extra credit, you can grab that. There's pizza in the back, we got the court, and water. So please,